Okay, so thank you so much for being here. It's nice to see a bunch of friends. And what I want to talk today is, first of all, trying to introduce myself. I'm a biologist and an ecologist. I work with plants, but today I'm more interested in this background of my formation as a biologist is talking about evolution and more importantly how that impacts society and how it influence the way we understand the living world. So to start with the presentation, I would like to show you this. um, Probably you're familiar with this kind of view. This is a starry night, and you can imagine humanity in the last 1,000 years have been staring at this. And one thing that is very interesting about that is people come with different ways to explain what they are seeing. So every single culture over time trying to put some kind of pattern out there and try to understand some kind of narrative that explains the distribution of those stars in the sky and also the process to make those stars look like that. And as you can imagine, these kind of stories, even when they are prevalent, they are ubiquitous across cultures, they are completely different between cultures. There is Greek, Chinese, um, African, Native American, anything you can imagine, they all have the same idea of trying to explain what they see up there, but none of those combination of constellations actually overlap with each other. So my interpretation of that is that we have that need to understand patterns in nature, and then we try to put the best answer that we can imagine to understand that. And then I have a couple of examples how that may work. This is one example of a picture that people took in Costa Rica recently on the sky in this coronavirus crisis. And that happened right after people took the patron of Costa Rica, La Virgen de los Angeles, up there in an airplane and flew around the country to protect the country against the virus. So you can imagine that probably, I mean, more rational people would think that that is a totally worthless effort and probably is a waste of taxpayers' money. But some of these people found these parents in the sky that they see as an angel protecting the country. So they thought that that confirmed that taking the Virgin up there actually had an effect, and then the country is protected against the virus. And so far, we are in pretty good shape down there. So who knows? But then you can see a pattern like this, and I'm completely positive that nobody in Costa Rica can tell what is there. That nobody will see any pattern in that particular set of clouds. But if you show that to a Muslim person, they will see the pattern of the name of Allah in the sky. So this interpretation, how we see nature, are contextual to our culture. And we try to reinforce ideas that we already have there, even because we come with those conclusions or because somebody else told us that that was the right conclusion, and we are happy with that answer. So I don't know what you see there, but you can make a story about it. And then there is, people in the Greek mythology, for instance, that found that some god was trying to seduce a woman and they become two trees because they were, there was a profanity, there was about forbidding love and you shouldn't do that. So God created these two different trees to forbid the love between humans and gods. Or we can go into psychoanalysis and just admit that everybody has their demand. It all depends on how you want to interpret reality. The difference when you go into something like psychology is that there are some principles that you can move across society. And that is part of the idea of how we understand reality. We look for this, you know, we as humans have this amazing capacity to foresee potential outcomes. We can predict things based on patterns that we see, and our mind trying to fill gaps in that narrative with some particular story that will help us to understand the entire picture. And most of the time, we are pretty happy with that story, and then we move on. We never, or very few people actually question that. The problem is that our story is biased to our context, our cultural context, and also the kind of nature we have around. So one of the problems with this is when we start confronting different narratives, they contradict each other. And here is when we have all these conflicts among societies, and you know, we have a hard time taking decisions because we are not actually taking into account what we see, but what we want to see. So what happened with this confrontation of nature? In my case, that I study biology, what we do, like naturally as well, is trying to classify things. We try to put names on the animals, plants, fungi, everything we see around. We try to classify in different classes that we call species. That was kind of a loose concept, and the first attempt to actually make it in a real science that is called taxonomy is with Carlos Linnaeus. So he was the first person who introduced a systematic way to explain the patterns in nature in living things and define them as species. So obviously you can imagine that this person was very religious. This is in the 1700s. So his idea was he was trying to understand creation, trying to see what were the rules that God used to create plants and animals on the planet. And in that process, he was trying to understand the mind of God. Of course, when people start working on this, they realize that there were patterns that suggest that some species were more closely related to others. They looked very alike, and they would start having all the discussion about what a species is and what is the definition of that. But you know, overall, it didn't contradict in a main way our narrative of a single creation made by God. Later on, people don't only classify living things, but we start classifying dead things. And that is the science of paleontology. So first person who actually came with this term was Georges Cuvier in France. And he worked as a mastozoologist. He worked with mammals in the Museum of Paris. And some people took him to see an excavation that was done around Paris. And they found these big bones there. And he, as a mastozoologist, he figured out that those big bones were from a mammal. But when he put the whole thing together, he realized that whatever was there, it was not an animal that actually lived in Europe anymore. So that was a big question of how we have animals here, or evidence of animals here, that are not around us anymore. And his conclusion was that there was some kind of catastrophism. So there was some catastrophic events that happened in the past, and these species disappeared, and they were extinct. But overall, the last catastrophe we have was the big flood, in the biblical term, in biblical times, and that's why we have some of these bones around, is because in that catastrophe, some of these species disappeared, they weren't saved, and therefore we don't have them anymore, right? And then as they go deeper into different soil layers, they found other kinds of fossils. So they just got to the conclusion there were multiple catastrophes that happened over time, and we just have a record of the last one, that is when God created humans. Um, Around the same time, there was other people looking at patterns in the geology, patterns in the relief of the landscape. And one of these persons was Charles Lyell, that he actually went to the Grand Canyon here in the United States. And he measured how much sediment was moved by the rivers in that canyon. And then he calculated how long it will take to that place to be formed based on current movement of sediments there. And he realized that for something that massive to happen, it would take millions of years to get there. So that was a little bit of contradiction to the idea that the planet was only some thousands of years old. So he called this gradualism, and it was this idea that the planet had been forming in a very gradual way for a long, long time. Finally, we have another person you probably heard about. Is Thomas Malthus. He was a demographist, and his work was trying to figure out the rates of death and people being born in London. And on his studies, he figured out that it was a problem because we humans were very good at reproducing. And that excess of reproduction, that excess of people eventually will run out of resources. We couldn't keep the amount of resources in nature to the same level of the way we reproduce, and therefore there will be some kind of tragedy, some kind of conflict that it will bring the population down. There could be a war, or it could be famine, it will be not enough food, or people will start getting weak, and then they will get sick, and then a lot of people will die. And those cycles were unavoidable. So we will keep having these cycles over and over again. So again, that was kind of in conflict with the idea of a single creation where God was taking care of everything and everything should be fine. So here we get to Charles Darwin. So for him, it was interesting that he put all these ideas together. He took books of all these authors with him during a voyage to circumnavigate the world in 1839. And as part of reading all these and his own observations around different parts of the world, he got the conclusion that there were some fundamental conflicts between our narrative, our biblical narrative of the creation of the world, and the patterns that he observed on his voyages around the world. So some of those things, there are many potential conflicts, but there are three that are particularly important. One is the idea that creation is static. Like once the species were created, they never change. That is the way that is believed by most of the people that study the Bible. But he comes with the idea that it's actually a gradual change in species that actually diversify them over time. So similar to this idea of Lyell on the gradualism forming geography, he found that gradualism also change species over time, and they adapt to the environment and they start looking different over time. So that suggests that species were not static. They were constantly changing depending on selection on some of the phenotypes that we see. The second thing that was kind of contradictory is the idea that creation is balanced. And probably one good example of that is the idea that when it was the big flood, Noah put all these species in pairs in the ark, right? So beyond the problem of how to put all these species, I mean, like the amount of species that we already know were so diverse, how you get all these species at one point in time all in the same place is problematic. but beyond that is the idea that once you relate only pairs of them, they will reproduce to be back to the normal state of nature that was before the catastrophe, right? So the idea behind that is that there is some divine um, arrangement that will make this nature to go back to some kind of original state. Um, Darwin, on the other hand, figured out, similar to Malthus, that it was a lot of reproduction. Like it was actually species have an excess of reproduction, and that is an adaptation to try to survive over time. So species try to reproduce as much as possible, and then the environment selects. And there is not necessary divine intervention in this process. The other thing that was hard for Darwin when he was working with his theory is the idea that creation is moral. And this is something that is fundamental in theism, the idea that God is good, especially for the Judeo-Christian tradition, and then everything he created has to be good. So what is the problem with that is then when you actually observe nature, you find a lot of behaviors that in our perspective are evil or at least are immoral. So you can find things like incest, infanticide, genocide that are common. They are observed in species all the time. And those are hard to pair with the idea of a good God that actually put them together. I put an example here. I won't run the video, but this is something that you find in tropical countries, tropical jungles in Central and South America, where you find these zombie ants. And what happened with these guys is actually there's a spore of a fungi that infect this species, and the fungi is able to manipulate the behavior of the ant. And these ants not only go to a place that is good for the fungi to sporulate and germinate and spread the spores, but also they go to places that will make more likely to the species of fungus to infect more ants. And the way they kill the ant is horrific. I mean, these guys actually invade the species alive, and then there is a spore, there is like the reproductive body of the fungus coming out of the living ant. And then, that's the dead end at the end of the reproduction cycle of the fungus. So that kind of twisted story of how these fungus reproduce makes a really hard argument against the idea that there is a designer that actually, is full of love and it will create everything in a good way, when some of these things seems to be so twisted and cruel. So now we have this kind of ambiguity. We have this nice, easy to understand narrative of how we were created and how important, especially we as humans, we want to feel like we are the center of creation and everything is around us. So we have to move to that narrative, to this narrative, where it's complicated. We are not in the center of anything. Actually, if you have to see where we'll be, you have to follow this long branch, this green branch there, where these are all eukaryotic life. And we will be probably one of those little tips there. So we are not central in the story of evolution at all. And that is something that is a hard reality to swallow to some people. So I guess one of the things that I have to deal a lot with my profession is the idea of we can balance both. Can we have this dual reality where we accept the religious narrative and at the same time understand the evolution narrative and be okay with both? And a lot of people really try hard to make a balance between the two and trying to make it work. There are some big difference between the two approaches to understand life on the planet. And here I'm using some of the principles that you need in both narratives and the difference between them. And then when I'm using the term religious, I'm very loose about this, and I'm just thinking about potential ideas that we use to interpret reality, interpret our world around us, but they don't need necessarily evidence for that. So it not only religious in the terms of religion, but also could be some ideas like economical ideas or philosophical ideas that we tend to favor even when we don't have a lot of evidence to prove it. So as you can see, there are like everything about how we make the interpretation is related to knowledge. So how we create that knowledge in terms of the religious narrative is a revelation. It has to be some angel god or, you know, illuminated philosopher that come with an idea, and that idea turned out to be the absolute truth. In terms of the scientific narrative, what we, oops, sorry, we use logic, and there is a method where you contrast ideas, you come with some prediction of those ideas, and then you test it to see if it's true or not. So it's not about your feelings, it's not about how identified you feel with that idea, it's more about how well you can support that idea. So where you get the source for that knowledge, in the case of the many of the religions, is some kind of scripture or traditional knowledge that is developed over time. And as I said, is kind of a need in our species to create this kind of stories that will fill the gap for things that we don't understand. In the case of the scientific narrative is evidence. So what we need is actual data that will support that. So for proof of that knowledge, in the case of the religious narrative, there is a lot of faith. It is actually the opposite of needing evidence for anything. Meanwhile, in the scientific narrative, there is data that you need. And now with the advance of computers, we are also using a lot of modeling. They're basically using previous information to project future scenarios without going to the field to measure everything, but still is based on hard data. Finally, you can, and this is very important in both narratives, is how well you can predict the future with it. In the case of the religious narrative, what you have are prophecies. So there are ideas that people say they can tell about what's going to happen in the future, depending on our behavior and so on. But these prophecies usually are only fulfilled or only confirmed after they're fulfilled. So you just have to wait until things happen to say, yeah, I was right. But you cannot tell when they're going to happen. It's all out of your control. In the case of the scientific narrative, there is a very strong tool that we have, is this potential of projection of our results to predict the future. And that make it more accurate to predict what is going to happen based on previous patterns that we already saw. And finally, there is this idea of the certainty, and this is very important for us because the religious narrative gives us an absolute certainty. You just want to believe that what you are listening or you believe is true, and there is an absolute meaning on that. There is no way to deviate from that, because that will suggest that your faith is not strong enough. So in the case of the scientific narrative, the certainty of a conclusion is usually relative to the evidence. So you can change your way of thinking if you find data that will contradict your previous knowledge. So there is nothing wrong with it. And there's a big difference between our way we understand things in a religious narrative and the way we see it in a scientific narrative. Okay, so what could go wrong with that? but why? I mean, that's is a very common question that I have is like, well, we can have both, and there is nothing's going to happen. You know, scientists can work in their scientific way, and the rest of the people can be in the religious way, and we can be all happy, and nothing is going to change in society because of that. It's a little bit of a stretch. There are some potential problems with it, and there are examples of that. For instance, I put this example. This guy to the left is Al-Kasrami, that was the most brilliant mathematician in the Persian Empire um, in the times of the medieval times in the during the Arab Empire. So this guy was at the summit of the scientific knowledge in the Arab Empire, and it was the most historically influential time of the Arabs on the world, right? A few years later, actually less than 100 years later, it came this philosopher Al-Ghazali, who declared that math was a sin, and it was against the religion. It was against the developing of a good Muslim person to believe in mathematics. And that over time actually bring down the influence of the Arabs in the scientific world to the point that today most of the Muslim communities have a hard time with the developing of scientific ideas, and some of these countries, the universities don't even have any kind of career that is related to mathematics or technology at all. They only do degrees in philosophy, theology, and literature. So you can see that over time, it can be a huge effect of saying that we can coexist with both narratives, especially if one of them take over the other. And we can go to the other extreme of this. And it's like, yeah, you can get some of these ideas and project them in a dangerous way. And this is an overlap between what I said before, that is not only religion, but also some philosophical or social ideologies that can use scientific principles in their own narrative. So these are famous philosophers. Francis Galton was the guy who came with the idea that then if there is evolution in the human race, then they should be superior races and inferior races. And it created the whole, the foundation of what is eugenics, and justify a lot of the racist ideas that were already present in Europe at that time. He just used evolution to justify them. Same way with some of the ideas in socialism were derived from evolution, and then there was this interpretation of evolution in a societal way that it will suggest that there will be these struggling classes and there will be the replacement of classes over time. Similar with the anarchism, there was all the rebellion against social structures. So all these were interpretations in a religious way of scientific ideas. So we can get it wrong both ways, and both ways are dangerous in their own way. And right now we are also dealing with the problem of our narrative, our ideology right now, that the free market and capitalism is the solution for everything, without seeing any evidence of that, and then we just deny anything that is against it, especially when there are scientific arguments against that, to say that there is some kind of conspiracy against these ideas. So we need to be careful about how we use this knowledge, and how people around us actually use it as well. So, as I said, I'm using the religious narrative in a very loose way that is not only related to religion as a God-related entity, but also some other ideas that we consider that are true even when we don't have evidence to prove it. One of the big problems with this religious narrative is actually stunt creativity. And the big problem I see with this is that once you get an absolute truth, then the research that you can do can only confirm that truth. So anything that you get that is against that, it will be heretic, or it will be useless. So there has got to be something wrong if you find something that doesn't corroborate what I already know. And that is a way to stop knowledge and stop discovery. And that is one of the big problems I see with trying to balance or reconcile the this religious narrative with a scientific narrative. We close our minds to actually explore new things. In my case, for instance, I study below ground parts on the plants. I study the roots of plants. And when I look in the Bible about these, I found absolutely no idea how to study roots. Like there's something that wasn't in the mind of people who wrote the scriptures in their time. So I will have absolute no hypothesis to prove based on the Bible. I would just have to say that God created the trees in a special way that made them able to get their nutrients and the water, and there is no way, it's too complicated for the human mind to understand. So this is the kind of example of how difficult it is to move forward when you have to base your research, your curiosity on an absolute truth that doesn't cover everything. The other problem that we can see here with this religious narrative is that it lacks a vision of how to deal with problems. So if we think that there has to be some kind of divine inspiration to find leadership, then we can disregard experts. We can disregard people who actually understand better just because in our own narrative, in our own interpretation of the word, that is too complicated and that is too cumbersome to grasp. So what we do is just trying to get some divine intervention. And now that we are being in this coronavirus crisis, we see lots of examples of people who have been tied up, though they are being cynical about the actual problem that's been described by many experts, just because you think that, you know, thinking that it will go away by its own or just praying will eliminate the problem in our lives. And then, you know, the consequences of that are very high. So I think diminish the importance of the scientific evidence just because it's inconvenient is one of the big problems that we have following this religious narrative. And the third problem I will say expose is that when you are not prepared to understand this kind of evidence, then you move to inaction. And I put an example. This is a graph of a paper that some collaborators wrote this year. Is showing what is the trend in growth of tropical trees in Africa and South America, right? And then you can see over time, based on information that we have until 2010, 2015, people is projecting what is going to happen in the future. So it's a worrisome trend. What we are seeing here is tropical trees or tropical forests is stop growing, and actually over time they can become sources of carbon rather than sinks of carbon. So we will exacerbate the problem we already have with the accumulation of CO2 in the environment. The problem is to make something about this. You have to understand what is the difference between a statistical model and a measurement-based hypothesis. You need to understand what are megagrams of carbon per year and you need to understand what having 0 megacarbons, megagrams of carbon per year means. And all that require some level of knowledge of science and interpreting data. And if we elect people who disregard this kind of information or just struggle because they don't understand, we are preventing people from taking action on this trend. And that is a very dangerous thing that we can do, not only with us, but also with people in the future when they have to deal with the consequences of that. And that is one of the problems that I'm seeing right now. Societies don't want to react to prevent problems. We are just reacting to problems. Even when we have the tools and we have the information to prevent some of these problematic events. And that is because we just choose to ignore it, and we have no consequences on ignoring that. Or at least the people who have to take action, they don't face any consequences for ignoring those actions. So, just to conclude that, I think that there is some space for these two narratives, but in a different level. I think the problem we want to create here is we want to integrate scientific knowledge and religious beliefs in some kind of overarching idea of society. I believe that you can separate that between two different realms. One that is the personal struggle of people that needs empathy and needs comprehension, needs support, but it's not really based on information. It is the personal struggle that you need social empathy. And that is something that the scientific evidence cannot provide to people. So in that way, we can have all these ideologies, all these religious beliefs in a way that are actually useful for people without being too cold or too detached from our actions, and actually consider people at individual level. On the other hand, we need this intellectual advance, and we cannot put try to reconcile the our religious or ideological ideas into these intellectual events. I feel like that actually stunned and make it more complicated. So that was something that we have tried to do in the past. And then it's funny, I found this figure. There is a medieval book where they try to make Jesus calculate pi. And I think that that is hilarious, the way they are actually trying to put science and faith together in a single thing. I guess the question is if this is actually possible. So with that, I just want to show you, this is one of the sites that I study down there in Brazil. And then you can see, this is my world, how I see it. Those are roots of tropical trees, and that's the kind of things that I study down there. And as I said, I'm very concerned about the things that I do and the development of my career depend a lot on the social support of these kind of studies. And I feel like not giving enough credit to the scientific knowledge and the funding of scientific ideas can be a problem that we can actually make difficult to study these things that it doesn't look like a great urgency right now, but are important things that we need to understand better. All right. So with that, I really appreciate everybody for their time and, you know, paying attention. I don't think anybody left or fall asleep so far. So if you guys have any questions, you want to ask me anything, just go ahead. Feel free to do it.
Hi, Oscar. It's just a simple question. Can you
Yeah,
hear me? You had a chart earlier on where you're pointing, it was a very beautiful design of like feathers, and you were pointing to one part saying, we're down here. Was that some kind of evolutionary graphic?
yeah, that is the tree of life. So that is a phylogenetic tree that represents everything from bacteria to whales. And yeah, in that graph, if you go to the let me see if I can put it back.
It looked a bit like fractals.
Yeah. Here we go. That one.
Yes.
Yeah. So the different branches represent different phyla, different taxa. One of these big branches, the two that are on top are all microbial communities. These are archaea and bacteria, and then the one that goes toward the right, the lower right, that is the
Mammals and bird animals.
that is all the eukaryotes. So that still includes some like fungi and things that are microscopic, and only the more upper right branch that is in green, that represents like microorganisms, macroorganisms. So that is plants and animals and some like marine stuff like coral and stuff like that.
Where does it start? The whole thing.
So it's supposed that there is some last common ancestor that is back there. There was something that appeared on the planet some 3.5 billion years ago, and then all the life evolved from that point.
Okay.
So you go back into the center of the tree, that would be like the common ancestor to all that life.
Okay.
And then everything derived from there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So is that plant kingdom and animal kingdom on the two branches, or?
Yeah, actually, if you see, like people now talk about domains. So we have a eukarya, and yeah, so that green branch in on the bottom right, it will be all the eukarya, and then we have eubacteria and sorry, the eukarya, then eubacteria, and there is another one, the archaea. So those are like now with molecular techniques, people have been separating all these different organisms there. So apparently there were two main groups, the archaea and the eubacteria, and then somehow there was a fusion between some archaea and eubacteria that generate what is the dicaryons. So those dicaryons are all these things that are in the lower right. So there's basically a fusion of the others. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen a tree like that before.
Yeah, this is like the most recent description of life on Earth based on molecular stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I know, it's beautiful. It just is more complicated than that underneath.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have a hard time because they don't feel identified with this. It's easier to identify with the idea that, you know, there was a special person that come down from heaven and actually create everything for us. And it's something that you can understand when you are 5 years old. This takes a lot of, you know, knowledge. You have to understand molecular, DNA, what is DNA, what is RNA, what is a mutation, and you know, all these concepts that are related to genetics and evolution. So a lot of people don't want to get into trouble.
Well,
And they feel like
their prime argument is that you won't have any morals if you don't have God.
Morals pre-existing before God.
right. Well, that was part of the idea I was telling you is that even nature, and that's a big conflict that Darwin had at his time, is that he discovered there was no moral. So it's not even like we have morals or not. This is very subjective of what you consider is a moral behavior or not. But also the point for him, the turning point was that his daughter that was 12-year-old, she died and some kind of respiratory disease. And for him, it was very hard to understand how a loving God would let her daughter die in a very painful way because she did nothing wrong. So that kind of, I mean, it happens to a lot of people when they get in this kind of emotional crisis. Some people actually turn into more religious and they actually use religion to overcome that pain. Other people just move away from it.
Right.
Eduardo, did you have a question?
I don't have a question.
Okay, because I noticed you unmuted yourself. So I suggest that when you finish your question to mute yourself again, because there's a lot of extraneous noises that you may not be aware of that the rest of us can hear all of. Duncan, are you asking a question now?
Oh, if you get me going, you couldn't stop me. But I thought you have, first, I think you have a very nice treatment that you gave. I took notes on it. And I agree with everything that you said. When you got towards the end, you had this personal struggle versus intellectual. I can't read my own adversary or.
Advance.
Anyway, I thought that's would be a pretty good point to jump off from and develop this further. What you had in your illustration had a lot of test tubes and microscopes and things on the side of science, and then this personal struggle was some sort of a man sitting in this configuration of this narrow stairway.
Right.
And but actually, I think that the science of psychology, the social sciences, are telling us a hell of a lot about ourselves, and they're telling us a lot things that are quite a bit more interesting than organic chemistry, too. And they're showing about our perceptions, how our perceptions are determined. A lot of it is by the survival criteria that we've been living under for the last million years or so, or maybe last 100,000 years even. And that we have certain biases, and that we don't. We understand quite a bit, but we don't understand ourselves completely, and we don't understand ourselves in large groups, and hence you have wars, and we don't understand ourselves even in civilization right now because we have too many different forces that we're being led around by, like Judas goats leading sheep. And but the social scientists can tell us quite a bit about this if we take their findings and we make our own synthesis of it, and that would also be a kind of an elevation of the human being, which is an objective of humanism. To do that, to have a better understanding of ourselves and be more candid about that.
Yeah, I think that it could be in the future a lot of replacement of some of these institutions. So, you know, clubs or churches or things like that, as we understand better ourselves, and maybe we'll figure out ways to treat problems like depression, anxiety, I don't know, suicidal tendencies and stuff like that over time when we understand better our biochemistry and our brains. We still have a lot of a deal to understand about ourselves. On the meantime, I get the uncertainty of people. We were educated in some kind of religious upbringing, and for a lot of people is really hard. I mean, I'm thinking about my parents, for instance, and it's basically impossible for them to understand a world without those institutions protecting them. And so I think it's also a little pretentious to suggest that we can just replace religious institutions. I mean, even not only that, but even economical institutions. I have, I mean, as an ecologist, I have a hard time understanding the principles of economy. That, you know, economical growth is a given, and then we have to grow every year, and then we have to keep consuming. These things, from my perspective of an ecologist, are nonsense. And I don't think anybody in economy actually provide evidence to show how this is even possible. We just believe that it has to be like that.
Well, we're democracies, so we can cast laws that change the rules and make things more fair.
Yeah, I think the important thing with democracy is that we need to learn how to select our leaders. And I truly believe that we should start putting rules also in the kind of people that can be elected. And because we can do the same thing that the Persians did 2,000 years ago and go with what make us feel better and elect people and, you know, impose rules on our own good being just because we feel more comfortable. So I think what we see right now with populism growing up is this idea of comfort rather than you know, actually looking for people who are capable to take conscious, you know, effective measures to solve problems.
Well, don't you think you need better education too, on a general level, lift the whole level of education higher?
Yeah, I mean, like
Make that necessary in society?
Well, you can see how creationism grew in the United States in the last 20 years. So this is what we can talk more about this, but now it's something like a third of the population of the United States believe that creation is the right way to understand nature. And even more than half of the people think that there is some kind of overlap between Darwinism or Darwin creation, Darwin evolution and creation. And that suggests that people are more comfortable with the idea that you have to appeal to some priest or some you know, religious figure in your life than is to actually understand how science or, you know, how even biology works. So that is something I think is in the rise in many places, and that is affecting what kind of leaders we have and what kind of leader we want. And, you know, it's a democracy, so we will go with the majority. Whatever we decide, we will have to follow that. So if the majority of people start getting the wrong ideas, then we will start electing leaders that will have those wrong ideas in their heads. And
Oscar?
yeah.
I just wanted to, in the hopes of democracy, is there anybody else that wants to ask a question? Because I've got one and I don't want to out.
Well, I've got another quick one.
Mm-hmm.
It was going back to, you had the two Arabs there going back, the one who invented algebra.
Yeah.
I didn't hear what you said after that they're not strong in mathematics now, the Arabs, because of religion, or what was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this guy Al-Ghazali, he was a philosopher in the Persian Empire, and he convinced the emperor to think that teaching mathematics was a sin. That it was not something that was created by the Quran, and therefore it should be simple to teach students that. So they basically outsource all their scientific knowledge, or at least, you know, mathematical development, to other countries. And a lot of these countries still depend on other countries to generate that kind of information. They don't
Yeah.
produce scientific papers anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who hasn't spoken who would like to ask a question? I'm going to speak right now, since
Go
I
ahead.
haven't spoken. So Oscar, because you have such vast knowledge of plant biology, and that illustration you showed us of the roots, and also previous illustration of people conceptualizing that the Holy Bible didn't have anything about how plants might source their food from their roots and their rhizoids, all that. I'd really like to hear more about that. Can you elaborate? Like, because I know that at the UU there was a group of people who were talking about how plants communicate with each other, and I know that there's research about that now. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about that?
Okay. My field of research is below ground ecology. So I study how plants relate to each other and relate to organisms that live in the soil, like bacteria, fungi, some invertebrates. So one of the things that I discovered in my research is that there is some patterns in the way plants acquire the capacity to live on land, right? So you think about this, all plants come from algae that were living in water, and somehow they adapt to move to dry land and start getting their nutrients and everything there. And that was a big challenge, because when you are in water, all the nutrients and everything is around you. So you just absorb that, and then you get the nutrients you need, and then you work with it. When you move out, then there is no nutrients in the environment anymore. You need to scavenge for them. And that was a thing that plants did some 400 million years ago, when they start getting out of the water and they start colonizing the land. So one of the things that they did is they associate with fungi. Fungi were already there outside for, I don't know, 300 million years, something like that. So they were very good at getting the nutrients from the soil. So plants, what they did is they developed these things that is what we call now roots, and they create a habitat for the, they create a habit for the plants to a symbiotic relationship with the fungi to get the nutrients. So what happened is these plants relate to the fungi, but there is a tricky relationship, because fungi can be pathogens too, and they can parasite the plant. So plants have to play with this role of needing the fungi to get the nutrients, but at the same time control them, that they won't spread into the plant and kill it. So plants over time, what they evolve is to be more and more efficient getting the nutrients by themselves, and try to use these fungi in a more controlled way. That's kind of the results of my dissertation when I work with this, is that as plants were evolving over time, they create some mechanisms to actually rely less on the fungi and being more effective to get the nutrients by themselves. And you know, what you see now in a tropical forest is a combination of those strategies. So you will find species that are highly independent on the fungi, and then you also have species that are still very, very depending on them. And somehow these groups of plants still coexist together, and they seem to be doing fine.